Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable. Let your arms go heavy, your breath slow. And as you listen, feel free to leave a comment sharing what time it is, where you are, and what city or village you're listening from. It's love to know. And if you'd like more quiet stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe so they gently appear when you need them most. Now, let's begin. There is a silence in the swamps of southeastern Georgia that even the frogs and crickets respect. The air smells like wet leaves and rotting wood, and the still water reflects the gnarled cypress knees jutting up like old, knotted fingers. If you didn't know what you were looking for, you wouldn't find it. Most don't. Most pass over these forgotten places, too humid for comfort, too empty for maps, and too inconvenient for history. But in the late 1800s, a railroad surveyor, his name only partially preserved in a contractor's ledger, as W.H. Tennyson, walked too far from his crew. According to a note scribbled in the margin of a land claim, Tennyson had discovered bone fragments of unknown make while clearing brush near the Satilla River basin. The entry ended there. No bones were turned in, no museum records list of Tennyson, and no newspaper clippings offer more. But 87 years later, 1974, a forestry worker clearing a firebreak found what Tennyson likely saw. Not one skeleton, but over a dozen. Shallow graves. No stone markers, no pottery, no beads, no arrowheads, no trade goods. Just human remains, brittle with age buried under a decaying lattice of cypress roots and river silt. Forensic analysis, quietly, published in a short paper by the Georgia Historical Review, confirmed that the bones were between 800 and 1,000 years old. The skull shapes and dental wear patterns suggested they were indigenous, but the tribal affiliation, no match. Not Muskogee, not Timucua, not Guale, nothing, not even a name. The land around the Satilla River had long belonged to shifting native territories, some documented, some erased by war, treaties, or simply disinterest from white cartographers. Before colonists ever heard of Georgia, the region was already layered with movement, retreat, and redefinition. The Muskogee Confederacy, also called the Creek, dominated parts of this area by the 1700s, but they were latecomers compared to the older coastal peoples like the Guale and the Mocama. Still further back, before written language, before horses, before maps, there were smaller groups. They didn't leave cities. They didn't etch their names into Spanish diaries, but they left bones, hearths, and stories now scattered like pollen across the coastal winds. The tribe with no name may have been one of them. Anthropologists rarely speak in absolutes. When they do, they usually regret it. But in the case of the Satilla remains, one thing was agreed upon. The people buried here had been deliberately removed from cultural memory. There were no oral histories among nearby tribes that matched the burial patterns. The bones had been placed in narrow communal pits, arms folded tightly to the chest, heads facing due east style, found nowhere else in the known southeast burial records. Nearby pottery shards were crude, undecorated, and hand-shaped without the coil method common in the region. The clay had been poorly fired, probably open pit fired, and bore no tempering agents like crushed shell or grit. In other words, these weren't traded goods. They were made locally. And then there were the teeth. Nearly every adult skeleton had heavily worn molars, flattened by grit-heavy diets, probably made worse by sand and stone-ground maize. But there were also breakages, abscesses, and signs of infection. The dental disease was advanced. One mandible, probably belonging to a middle-aged woman, showed a large cavity that had bored clean into the jawbone. This wasn't a healthy people, but they had endured. Historians believe the tribe may have lived near the coast, perhaps migrating inland during a long drought. The late woodland period, roughly 500 to 1000 AD, It's a time of climatic instability in the southeastern U.S. tree ring data from longleaf pine cores suggests prolonged dry seasons and unpredictable rainfall. If these people relied on shellfish or estuarine fishing, the drought would have devastated their economy. Salinity changes would have killed off oysters. River levels would have dropped. Agricultural fields might have turned to dust. Their retreat into the swamp was not accidental. It may have been their final refuge. The bones were found on a rare patch of dry ground in ancient sandbar, barely elevated above the waterline. Satellite analysis, years later, revealed faint geometric outlines in the vegetation, almost rectangular, in shape suggesting decayed post structures. There had been homes here, or huts, maybe a ceremonial building. No stone, no metal, just wood, grass, and earthall, long reclaimed. They hadn't just died here. They had lived, but then gone. No destruction layer, no ash, no mass trauma on the bones. These people didn't perish in a battle. They weren't slaughtered in a raid. There were no arrowheads embedded in ribs, no defensive ditches. They faded, quietly. Perhaps they split apart, or perhaps disease did what war could not. The early medieval warm period saw not only drought, but also increased mosquito populations in wetland areas. Some researchers suggest that vector-borne illnesses, perhaps early strains of malaria, may have weakened swamp-bound communities. And if the remaining few turned to the coast or tried to, there's no guarantee they were welcomed back. Many native societies practiced cultural distancing when it came to sickness, death, and outsiders. A group returning from a failed inland migration might have been viewed with suspicion. Stories may have warped over generations. The name of the tribe may have slowly become taboo, and in time, forgotten. It's not the only time this happened. Archaeologists have discovered other burial clusters in the southeast that don't match known tribal lineages. Each case is debated, footnoted, and contested, but a pattern emerges. Small groups, local materials, unusual burial patterns, no oral trace, and always in places slightly out of reach swamps, ridgelines. FLOODPLANS. The tribe with no name may have been one of many who slipped through the gaps between contact terra maps and modern memory. But one detail remains unexplained. In the center of the burial cluster, among the roots of a large water tupelo, excavators found a stone unusual for the region, etched with an indecipherable symbol. It had been placed carefully under a folded arm. Some thought it was just a river rock. Others thought it was a token, but no one could read it, and no tribe claimed it. The woods surrounding the Satilla River are deceptively still. Cypress trees bend gently at the ankles, their roots clutching the mud like long fingers. Spanish moss dangles like whispers, and if you stand still long enough, it begins to feel like time has stopped, suspended in the hush of swamp heat, in the slow rhythm of dripping water. It was here that the last traces of a forgotten people were laid. Deep in the soil, under layers of loam, rot, and indifference. Not conquered, not named, just placed. Section 3 of this story begins not with a new discovery, but with the re-examination of an old one. The bones themselves, the remains of the child, found in the center of the burial ring, later dubbed Specimen A29, have become the emotional and academic center of the entire Satilla mystery. While the bones were returned to the earth decades ago, casts and digital scans allowed researchers like Ray Whitlock to reconstruct aspects of the child's life and death in painstaking, respectful detail. The child had been between 8 and 10 years old, based on dental eruption and femur length. Their sex remains unknown. Fragile indicators like pelvic shape were too degraded to determine definitively. The bones bore no signs of trauma, no blunt force, no cuts, no defensive wounds. They died quietly. But there were other details. Strange ones. First, the child's teeth. A series of shallow grooves were carved into the enamel of the two upper canines, decorative or symbolic dental modification. Its practice wasn't unknown in North America, but it was rare in the Southeast. It had been seen in parts of Mesoamerica, where warriors and nobles sometimes filed their teeth or inlaid them with jade. But this was different. There were no signs of filing, no jewels, no dental tools nearby. Just those two symmetrical notches, like an invisible mark placed to identify or elevate or warn. Whitlock proposed it may have been a rite of passage symbol, possibly linked to the child's role within the community. If the burial ring truly indicated spiritual centrality, then the child may have been more than a son or daughter. They may have been a prophet or a sacrifice. The second detail came from soil analysis. Beneath the body, the soil was rigid, arched. By decomposition? Yes, but also by something else. Layers of burnt ash, compacted and sterile, as if a fire had been lit and extinguished before the burial occurred. This ash wasn't spread across the entire gravesite, only beneath the central child. It contained traces of hardwood, charcoal, mostly oak and hickory. No bone ash, no animal remains. A clean fire, then a burial. Why burn a fire beneath a body? In some traditions, fire cleanses the earth, burning away bad spirits, inviting good ones, or symbolically preparing the soil for rebirth. But to build the fire before laying the body, that suggests a ritual space of prepared ground, a sacred hearth nearby. A lesser-known grave catalog, number 31, belonged to an elder, possibly in their 60s, based on dental wear and spinal compression. Unlike the others, this individual was buried with a circular arrangement of small river stones around their head. One stone bore a faint reddish hue. Upon chemical testing, it was found to contain trace amounts of ochra, natural clay pigment used for painting and ceremonial marking. Ochra was sacred. It was life, blood, earth, spirit. If this elder was a spiritual figure, shaman, keeper, ritual leader, they may have presided over the burial. They may have known the fire's meaning. They may have chosen the child. Among some Algonquian-speaking peoples to the north, there were legends of sun children, young ones believed to carry the light of understanding or prophecy. In some tales, they were protected. In others, they were taken. Could this have been something similar? Could this child, central in death, silent in record, have been seen as a bridge between people and sky? The carved stone certainly hinted at solar alignment. The Eastwood burials suggested rebirth. The ceremonial fire hinted at ritual. But what kind of ritual would place a child at the center of death? It's tempting to romanticize these fragments, to turn every symbol into mysticism, to assume every broken shard is a holy relic. But sometimes, loss isn't ceremonial. It's ordinary. What if the child had died suddenly of fever, or drowning, or something now lost to time? What if the people, devastated, created meaning around the death, placing the child at the center to symbolize grief? And what if this grief became tradition or taboo? There's a concept in anthropology called cultural silencing, a process by which certain people, events, or beliefs are intentionally excluded from record, not out of hate, but out of fear or discomfort. Sometimes, this silencing begins with one generation. A mother refuses to speak of a lost child. A village avoids the sight of a tragic fire. A tribe stops naming a certain illness in oral societies. If no one speaks it, it disappears. If the Satilla people had a tragedy, they couldn't explain disease, betrayal, a failed harvest. They may have built a ritual around it. Perhaps the child's death became the centerpiece of a mourning practice. Perhaps future children were named in their honor, or not named at all. And then, one day, they stopped. No one remembered the symbol. No one remembered the songs. The grave became swamp. The tribe became silence. In 2021, Ray Whitlock published her final paper on the Satilla findings. It was called The Memory of Soil. In it, she wrote, "History is a pattern of remembered exceptions, but there are people who lived outside those patterns not because they were irrelevant, but because they were inconvenient. Their silence is not emptiness, it is resistance. And if we are quiet enough, the earth still tells their story." Whitlock died in 2022 after a long illness. Her research remains archived in full at Georgia Southern, where students continue to digitize the remaining field maps and catalogs. Each year, a handful of students visit the old Satilla site. The grave is gone, of course, reburied under federal guidelines, returned to the land. But the spider lilies still bloom, quiet, delicate, soft white, like curled bone. And the swamp remains, patient, watching, remembering what people forgot. Reflection. Why do we forget those who believed differently? Why does history preserve the in? Loud, but not the meaningful? And how many more tribes rest under our feet, waiting not for rescue but for recognition? Not every story ends with discovery. Some end in silence. But silence, too, is part of the story. It sat in a cardboard evidence box for nearly 30 years. The stone, flat, smooth, slate-colored, was not spectacular, about the size of a palm. Oval, lightly scratched by time and sand. Most archaeologists who handled it described it as probably incidental, just a rock, an inclusion, a natural curiosity mistaken for something meaningful. And yet, it had been placed deliberately when it was first unearthed in 1974. The team cataloged it as object number 19, flat stone, engraved, possibly symbolic. The symbol was faint, carved, not etched. A single shallow groove arched across the middle, bisected by 3 smaller vertical lines that curved like saplings in wind.no. Matching motifs existed in any southeastern tribal archives. It wasn't Mississippian, not Caddoan, not even archaic abstract. It didn't fit, so it was ignored, then reboxed, then forgotten until 2003. That year, a doctoral student named Ray Whitlock, researching pre-contact burial cultures in the southeast, requested access to the Satilla River site archives. The bones had long since been reburied, but the field notes, maps, and item catalogs remained in a basement archive at Georgia Southern University. Whitlock noticed the rock immediately. What caught her attention wasn't the carving. It was the location. Unlike most grave goods typically placed near the feet or head, the stone had been placed beneath the left arm of a skeleton in the center of the burial pit. Not just any skeleton, a child, roughly 8 to 10 years old. Why give a child a symbol one no one else received? Why place it with such care? Why bury them in the exact center of a communal grave? Whitlock photographed the symbol under raking light. She enhanced the grooves with digital imaging. Still, it defied categorization. But when she overlaid it with basic solar alignments, you noticed something odd on the summer solstice. The sun would rise directly over the groove's arch. That may have been coincidence. But in ancient cultures, coincidence was rarely that simple. A pattern was beginning to emerge, not just from the Satilla site, but from other forgotten burials across the coastal southeast. In 1991, a similar cluster of bones had been found in southern South Carolina, again, lacking cultural markers. There, a ceramic shard was recovered with a partial symbol, not identical, but close. A long arc, 3 branches, slightly skewed, with these members of the same tribe. Had they split generations earlier, each fragment wandering until it disappeared into the lowlands? Or had they always lived isolated fragments of a people never recognized by broader tribal networks? If so, why were they never remembered? The concept of erasure is common in colonial history. We think of forced forgetting as something done to others. European empires burning texts, American schools erasing language, missionaries forbidding native songs. But erasure can happen internally, too. Some tribes, when struck by plague or disaster, would dissolve the names of the dead. In Choctaw tradition, bone pickers were forbidden to say the names of those they cleaned. Among certain Muskogee clans, a person who died from contagious illness could not be mourned publicly. Grief took forms that prioritized survival. To forget was sometimes to protect. What if the tribe with no name wasn't erased by outsiders, but by kin? The absence of trade goods at the Satilla site was telling. No copper, no beads, no iron, nothing that indicated connection to the Mississippian trade network that flourished from 800 to 1500 AD, even small. Isolated groups usually had something: fragments of shell necklaces, bits of mica, sandstone effigies. But these graves had nothing but bones and clay. And yet, the site layout suggested organization. There were patterns in how the dead were arranged: spines aligned east, heads nestled together like spokes in a wheel. The central child had been placed precisely in the middle. If this was a random grave or an emergency burial, such care would have been unlikely. This was ceremonial, which meant they had belief, they had ritual, they had culture, they had memory. So, where did it go? There's an unsettling possibility explored in Whitlock's later work. What if they were erased because of what they believed? In her 2007 thesis, The Unnamed and the Unspoken, Burial Practice and Spiritual Dissonance in Pre-Contact Georgia, Whitlock speculated that the tribe with no name may have held religious beliefs considered taboo by neighboring peoples. For example, most southeastern tribes buried their dead facing west, the direction of the setting sun, representing the land of the ancestors. East-facing burials were rare. Among the Muskogee, they were sometimes associated with those who died in disgrace or under bad medicine. But in Satilla, every skull faced the east, and the central child was facing straight up. In oral traditions, direction matters. North is cold and deathly. South is fertile and chaotic. West is wise and ancient. East is rebirth. To face east in death might have meant hope or heresy. Whitlock proposed that the Satilla tribe may have followed a dissident spiritual model, one that placed the sun's rise, not its setting, at the center of their beliefs. That would align with the carved symbol. That would explain the burial layout. It might also explain why other tribes chose to forget them, not because they were unworthy, but because they were different. And difference in tight-knit oral societies could be dangerous. Other evidence surfaced in the early 2010s. A coastal excavation near St. Simon's Island uncovered a Medina refuse heap containing dozens of broken clay tablets. Most were nondescript, but one fragment, about the size of a spoon, had a partial sunburst pattern, 8 lines radiating from a central dot. Carbon dating placed it between 850 and 950 AD, same range as the Satilla burials, same region. Was it a prayer, a warning, or just a decoration? No one knows, but the name of the tribe was never found. Not in any Spanish records, not in English colonial notes, not in modern Muskogee oral lists. Just silence. It's deliberate, generational silence. In 2017, Whitlock returned to the Satilla site. She brought with her a team of geographers and ethnobotanists. They weren't looking for artifacts, they were looking for plants, old plants, memory plants. Some tribes used vegetation to mark graves: periwinkle, elderberry, buttonbush. These could last generations, spreading in quiet patterns. And they found one, just one, a small patch of spider lily Hymenocallis occidentalis, native to the region, but rare in the wild. More common in cultivated ceremonial gardens. The lilies surrounded a shallow depression, long since caved in. Softened by rain, No grave marker, just the flowers. Just the silence. As the team left, Whitlock paused. She took one last look at the pit where the central child had once been. She held the stone object number 19 in her hand, running her finger over the faint groove. Somewhere in time, someone had held it with meaning, had carved it with care, had laid it beside a child, and asked the earth to remember. The earth had remembered. We had not. There's a part of the upper Missouri River where the water becomes so still, it feels like it's listening. The wind quiets. The cottonwoods lean close. And the land, cracked and yellowed from time, almost seems to hesitate, if unsure, whether to remember or forget. It was here, centuries ago, in this uneasy silence between prairies and bluffs, that a tribe once flourished, and then vanished. No name survived, no language, no stories passed down, no legends that echo today. They were real, though. We know this not from folklore, but from things they left behind. A broken ceramic shard with a painted thunder symbol. A child's bracelet made of deer vertebrae, delicate as breath. The remains of a circular village that defied every architectural pattern known to this region. And one thing more. One thing that changed everything. A piece of bark, preserved under ash, covered in symbols no one can read. This story begins with a drought in the early 2000s. The river basin near present-day Fort Peck, Montana, experienced one of the driest seasons on record. Reservoir levels dropped drastically, revealing sandbars in riverbeds long buried beneath the silt. Team of hydrologists doing erosion surveys noticed something strange. A perfect ring of dark earth, about 70 feet across, just beyond a bend in the river. The ring was invisible during most of the year. It appeared only when the water dropped low. Enough, and it vanished again each time the floods returned. Intrigued, the team sent aerial photos to the anthropology department at the University of Montana. Within a month, excavation had begun, and within weeks, the mystery grew darker. The site became known informally as Echo Ring. What archaeologists found there confused almost everyone. The ring wasn't a burial site. It wasn't a ceremonial mound. It wasn't even a defensive structure. It was a library, of a kind no one had seen before. Inside the ring, set into shallow pits in the hardened earth, were 24 bundles each, wrapped in bark and twine. Inside each bundle were thin sheets of birch, bone tools, and remnants of crushed charcoal. The bark bore markings. The bone tools were carved with grooves. The charcoal seemed to have been used for writing. These weren't weapons. They weren't tools for hunting or farming. They were for recording. Someone had written something here, over and over again. History, a prayer, a warning. We still don't know. The writing doesn't match any known native script from the plains or Great Lakes regions. It's not Chrysolabics, not Ojibwe winter counts, not Iroquoian wampum notation. Some have called it proto-writing symbols that carry meaning but don't form language. But the symbols repeated. One appeared often, a circle split by a jagged vertical line. Another resembled a falling bird. Still another looked like an A. Open eye turned sideways, and on nearly every bundle etched or painted was a series of dots, always 7, in a vertical line. Faded, but deliberate. There's a superstition among the Assiniboine elders of the Fort Peck region. It says there's a place near the river where you must not camp because it's cursed, but because the sky there is broken. No one can explain what it means. It's just something people say. Some believe it refers to violent storms that strike that bend in the river. Others claim it's about a long-forgotten battle, one in which the spirits never left. But after the Echo Ring was discovered, some elders came forward to speak privately with the researchers. They said there was a tribe here once, long ago, before the Assiniboine came. Before even the Mandan built their round villages, they had no horses, no corn. They lived by trapping and trading, and they had a rule. They never looked up at the sky after the first frost. To do so was considered dangerous. No one remembers why, just that the rule was followed until it wasn't, and then there were no more people. The echo ring revealed more than bark and symbols. A second dig site, just 50 yards away, uncovered skeletal remains, many of them children. The bones were bundled tightly, placed not in individual graves, but in shared pits. 2 or 3 bodies at a time. No signs of violence, no arrowheads, no burn marks or injuries, but in several skulls. There were indicators of extreme nutritional deficiencies, specifically signs of scurvy and anemia. This tribe had not died in war. They had died of hunger and something else. 2 adult skulls showed signs of trepanation, surgical holes cut into the skull with primitive tools, likely done while the person was still alive. This procedure was practiced in various parts of the ancient world for spiritual or medical reasons. It was used to relieve pressure, cure madness, or release bad spirits. Is this tribe trying to treat disease, mental illness? Were they performing desperate rituals, or were they simply following a belief we'll never understand? One of the most controversial findings came from a layer of ash discovered in the center of the ring. Testing showed it was from a fire that had burned green wood, not dry branches. That suggested one thing. The fire had been lit hastily in a panic. Charred bone fragments in the ash confirmed that something or someone was burned at the ring center, but the DNA was too degraded to match. A sacrifice, a cremation, a warning. One archaeologist, Dr. Susan Kilbridge, argued that the echo ring was not just a library, it was a message, a final record, perhaps an act of preservation or desperation. She wrote in her notes, this was a people who knew they were vanishing. They took their words, their symbols, their silence, and they placed them here, not to be found, but to be left behind. And then came the most disturbing discovery. One of the bark bundles, slightly separated from the others, contained something unusual. A carved obsidian shard, polished flat like a mirror. Across its surface was etched a single symbol, a lightning bolt splitting a tree. No, the bundles contained obsidian. Obsidian doesn't occur naturally in this region. It had been brought here, possibly traded from the Pacific Northwest. Someone had carried it hundreds of miles, and someone had used it to mark something final. Was this the sign of the tribe's death? Their memory of a storm, a sickness, or a betrayal? And why did they leave no name? Dr. Kilbridge proposed one final theory, controversial but haunting. She believed the tribe had made a conscious decision to erase themselves, not in a suicidal way, but in a sacred way. They chose to go unnamed. They chose to bury their knowledge in symbols. They chose not to be remembered by name, but by silence. In some cultures, there's a belief that to be remembered is to be trapped, that spirits must be allowed to forget and be forgotten, or they'll never rest. Was this tribe protecting themselves, or protecting us? The echo ring fills with water every spring. The river rises. The sand swallows it, and the ring disappears beneath the surface, quiet again. When the droughts return, it peaks out, but no new excavation has been permitted since 2009. Tribal authorities have declared the site sacred, untouchable, and so it waits for the next drought, the next eye willing to see, the next whisper beneath the broken sky. The river does not hurry. It carries memory like silt, soft, slow, easily scattered. It remembers everything and nothing all at once. And so, when the cottonwoods along its edge lean just a little, when the water bends in on itself near that curve in the earth where the echo ring waits, you might think the story is over. But the tribe that left without a name left more than we thought. And in Section 2, we go deeper not into myth, but into evidence, into forgotten records and missionary archives, into 19th century travelers' journals with odd sketches no one could explain, into oral traditions that no longer mention a tribe, but whisper about a storm that tore the stars apart. And in those whispers, a pattern began to emerge, one that some historians wished hadn't found. Let's begin in 1831. A Jesuit missionary named Father Henry Valois arrived in the northern plains, sent by the Catholic Church to minister to the wandering souls of the indigenous people. He was stationed near what is now Poplar, Montana. Like many missionaries of his time, Valois kept meticulous records not only of his sermons, but of everything he considered strange in his journals. Buried between Latin passages and ecclesiastical musings are 3 short pages titled simply, "The People Before." In them, Father Valois recounts a story told to him by an elder of the Nakota Assiniboine people, the elder, whose name Valois recorded phonetically as Chagoing, said that his grandfather had once walked the banks of the Missouri and found the circle where the words sleep. Valois wrote that the elder described a perfect ring of blackened earth, hidden by tall grass, which no birds ever landed on. In the center, the elder said, was a burned stump, rounded bones, but not just bone symbols. Carvings on bark. Valois dismissed the account as heathen superstition, but he added one strange footnote. Though Chagwin is old, and his beliefs are riddled with spirits, he claims the place is cursed not by death, but by forgetting. That to speak the names of the people who lived there is to invite their silence into your dreams. It is one of the only recorded mentions of the Echo Ring before its rediscovery in 2003. But that was just the beginning. In 1857, a fur trader named Jules Malraux passed through the upper Zorian route to Fort Union. His journals, recently digitized, contain hand-drawn sketches of ceremonial items he traded for among the Mandan. One sketch shows a bark scroll, about a foot long, wrapped in sinew. On the scroll are vertical lines, dots, and a single split circle motif in the margin. Malraux writes, "The elder said it came from those who do not speak. He traded it to me for 5 knives and a horse. Combs said it was cursed, but only if you open it during the night sky." Tropogists now believe this scroll may have originated from the same unknown tribe, but by the 1850s, no one remembered who they were. Even then, just 20 years after Father Valois heard Tagoan's story, the people were already being forgotten. Let's pause here. Why would a tribe be erased not by outsiders, but by neighboring tribes? There are several possibilities. First, they may have been too small, too isolated. Tribes like the Mandan and Hadassah, who lived in large fortified villages, often dominated regional trade and memory. Second, they may have practiced something so different, so culturally alien, that others chose to forget them out of fear or disapproval. Third, Dan. This is the most haunting theory. They may have been erased, not just from memory, but from story, from tradition itself. Not by accident, but by design in many indigenous cultures. To speak of the dead is to call them back. If this tribe's ending was too strange, too frightening, or too shameful, it's possible others chose silence as a form of respect or protection. This isn't a failure of oral history. It's part of its logic now. Back to the archaeological record. In 2009, a graduate student named Mallory Estes, working under Dr. Susan Kilbridge, made an overlooked discovery in the University of Montana Storage Archive. 2 unlabeled boxes containing small artifacts from the original Echo Ring dig. These included a wooden bowl carved with 3 concentric rings, a polished bone comb with 7 notches, a charred piece of bark with clear, repeating symbols, but the real find was a fragment of textile woven from grass and bark fiber. Rarely do such materials survive. Testing showed it was dyed with blue pigment. That was unusual. Blue wasn't common in Plains dyes. It required either rare berries or trade with tribes farther south. Where had this pigment come from? The lab determined it contained trace elements of indigofera, a plant native not to the plains, but to the American Southeast. This tribe, whoever they were, had trade connections that stretched far beyond their location. They weren't isolated. They were networked, yet still forgotten. Another mystery deepened with the second season of digging. The discovery of echo pits, small, bowl-shaped depressions lined with stones. When sound was made in the center of the ring, such as a spoken word or clap, the pits would amplify the echo across specific intervals. Some believe this was ceremonial. Others suggest it was mnemonic used to help remember oral records. Still others argue it was meant to create an auditory illusion. One researcher claimed that if you stood at the edge and whispered, you could hear your own voice return from behind you, distorted. Dr. Kilbridge called it an architecture of memory. Now what were they trying to remember? Or, more importantly, what were they trying to forget? In 2013, the Echo Ring site was officially closed. The Fort Peck Tribal Council designated it a site of cultural protection, halting any further digging. The decision was controversial. Some archaeologists wanted more excavation. Others believed it was time to let the silence rest. One elder, speaking anonymously, said this in a local interview. If they buried their name, maybe that was their medicine. Maybe that was their way of going home. We should not unbury people who try to leave quietly. Still, whispers continued. Researchers in Alberta, Canada, found petroglyphs in a sandstone cave showing 7 dots and a falling bird. An amateur linguist in Minnesota claimed to find a phonetic match between the echo, symbols, and fragments of Taimen's old Algonquian ceremonial chants. And a Dakota youth group, exploring their ancestral stories, created a digital archive to track tribes that vanished without trace. They found 9. The Echo Ring tribe is the 10th dot, and here's where the story folds in on itself. In 2021, during a controlled burn in western North Dakota, firefighters discovered a stone marker in the middle of a grassland clearing. The marker was small, only a foot tall, but deliberately placed. It bore no writing, but nearby, buried in shallow soil, was a bark-wrapped bundle. Inside, symbols: the split circle, the vertical 7 dots, carbon dating, placed at around 1450 AD, centuries before any written documentation. It was the Echo Ring people, again hundreds of miles from the Missouri. Had they migrated, split into smaller groups, tried to preserve their knowledge, or had someone else, another tribe, tried to carry their memory forward? We don't know, but someone tried. And that brings us back to the silence. There is something deeply human in choosing to vanish, in choosing to leave behind traces, but no names, in wrapping history in bark and fire and forgetting just enough to protect what matters. The Echo Ring people may never be known, but in their silence, they taught us something strange, that memory isn't always loud, that sometimes the most powerful histories whisper and wait and echo beneath the surface, just long enough to be heard again. By the time the snows return to the northern plains in early November, the land falls silent in ways the living rarely appreciate. Snow absorbs sound. It flattens memory. Footsteps vanish within hours, and even voices seem to fold inward. Trees, when they creak, do so like old bones. It's in this deep quiet that the last chapter of the Forgotten Tribe emerges, not from written record, nor oral tradition, but from the ground itself. For centuries, the tribe with no remembered name lay scattered under the frozen grasses. Their bones, their stories, their intentions, all stitched invisibly into the seams of the land. And though their language is gone, their final act, their last communal breath left behind a different kind of evidence, a pattern, a burial site, like anything known on the plains. discovered purely by accident. In 2020, during pipeline inspection near the Milk River Basin, workers stumbled upon what they thought were ancient Cans Rock mounds built for trail marking or ceremonial offerings. But when archaeologists were brought in, they realized something deeper lay beneath. Beneath 18 of the stone mounds, they found burials. But the bodies weren't just buried, they were arranged. 18 individuals, laid out not in rows or family groups, but in a wide, curved line, mirroring the arc of the night sky at solstice. Each skeleton pointed in the same direction, east-northeast, toward the rising point of a star, now known as Capella, the brightest star in the constellation Auriga.Y. In Plains cosmology, Capella is rarely mentioned, but in some obscure Algonquian and Iroquoian traditions, it represents a watcher star, one that guides the dead through the night sky when the others fall silent. The alignment wasn't random. These people were buried with intention, not just to be hidden, but to be remembered by something other than human memory. To be remembered by the sky itself. Let's take a closer look. Among the burials, only 2 artifacts were recovered in near complete form. A P. The rest had been broken, deliberately ritual. Destruction before burial, practice found in other indigenous contexts. The first artifact was a bone flute carved from the femur of a deer. The notches suggested it played a minor pentatonic scale, still used today in traditional music across continents. The second artifact was a small shell disc, clearly not native to the northern plains. Analysis confirmed it originated from the Gulf Coast, possibly from a bivalve traded upward through centuries-old networks stretching from the Mississippian cultures of Cahokia to the Dakotas in the center of the shell. A hole had been drilled. It was likely worn as a pendant, or possibly an amulet. But here's the important part. Inside the burial soil surrounding the shell were faint traces of red ochre pigment long used in burial rites from ancient Europe to the Americas, even in death. This tribe marked its crossing, with color, with sound, with the stars. It was not an accident. It was a message, not for us, perhaps, but for something older. Let's talk about the disappearing, because to be wiped from memory doesn't happen overnight. It happens in layers. The first layer is migration. A tribe splits either from drought, war, or famine. Its people scatter. Lineages fracture. Stories once told around shared fires lose context. The second layer is silence. If a community becomes stigmatized due to unusual beliefs, strange rituals, or accusations of taboo behavior, neighboring groups may cease speaking their name out of fear or custom. This is not erasure born of conquest. It is social forgetting. The third layer is translation. When early ethnographies and missionaries tried to record the beliefs of native tribes, they often misunderstood or ignored the entire categories of knowledge that didn't fit European frameworks. Words were miswritten, concepts simplified, rituals labeled primitive or sorcery. And the final layer is land. When the U.S. government broke treaties, created reservations, and forced removals in the 19th century, entire tribal networks collapsed. Groups who had once preserved memory through seasonal migration were confined to plots of land hundreds of miles from sacred sites, ancestral burial grounds, and their own origin points. By the time 20th century researchers came looking for the missing tribe, they were centuries too late. All 4 layers had already closed, but somehow, through stars, soil, and silence, the tribe had left a trail, a faint one, but not invisible. Now, here's where the story turned strange. In 2023, a linguist named Dr. Nathan Mooney, working on dormant Algonquian dialects, found something curious in a collection of late 1700s Jesuit letters archived in Quebec. One letter written by a missionary working along the Red River describes an encounter with a small band of peculiar natives who do not dance, do not sing, and carry smooth stones marked with tiny eyes. They called themselves transliterated, poorly by the missionary, Natoa. Mooney noticed the word resembled an extinct proto-language root for those who went away or those who do not speak. He traced similar roots in Old Menominee and Ojibwe vocabularies. Each hinted at a forgotten group, never named directly who left behind tools, but no greetings. Who carried bundles wrapped in silence? Were these the same people? It's hard to say. Language drifts, memory adapts, but if so, the term they may have used for themselves wasn't tribe at all. It may have been a verb, sentence fragment, not a name, but an action. A reminder that their disappearance wasn't tragedy, was intention. Let's return once more to the echo ring. After its closure, a decision was made by tribal elders and archaeologists alike. Nothing further would be excavated, not because the site was empty, but because the site had already said enough. Not everything must be known. Not every memory is ours to recover. But in the quiet, there are lessons. When the forgotten tribe left more than bones, they left the architecture. A forgetting, they showed us that memory doesn't always protect, that sometimes the most sacred stories must be hidden to survive. They left nothing but they meant to, and that, perhaps, is the most haunting part of all. So when you walk the plains in early winter, and the grasses bow under frost, and the stars tilt slightly toward Capella, don't expect to see monuments. Don't look for plaques. Look instead for circles, for windless places, for rings where birds do not land. There, maybe, you'll hear what they left behind, not in words, but in the shape of the silence itself. A silence that sings. A silence that remembers. Even when we forget. It begins, as many forgotten stories do, with water, not the kind that roars. Not the ocean, or a great lake, or even a thunderous waterfall, but a river that slipped quietly through the eastern woodlands. A soft current that wound around mossy stones beneath the thick canopy of oak and sycamore, so gentle it hardly made a sound in old colonial maps. It was sometimes labeled with a single word, unnavigable. In native languages now extinct, its name likely meant the one that hides. And on this river, lost between the folds of pre-colonial North Carolina and South Virginia, once lived a people whose name is no longer spoken. Not because it was too long, not because it was never recorded, but because they erased it themselves. They erased it slowly, deliberately, and for reasons no one alive today can fully explain. The first time the unnamed tribe appears in surviving records is in a French fur trader's journal from 1694. He never met them. He simply wrote this: the forest folk to the south speak of a quiet people who live by the river's bend. They do not trade. They do not speak in greeting. They keep smoke low and song softer. They do not wish to be remembered. By the time more formal surveyors passed through a few decades later, there was no one left to ask. The village sites were still there, waterland, structures half sunk into the damp ground, now overtaken by vines and mushrooms, pestles, fragments of pottery, even shallow burial pits, still dotted the riverbanks, but no one remained, not even the bones. Every burial site had been exhumed, every trace of their dead taken elsewhere, every sign of their lineage retracted, as though the tribe had folded back into the forest, as though they had never been there at all. And yet, they had. We know this because of one structure, one building, found deeper in the woods than the rest. It was the only one still intact when colonial surveyors mapped the region in the early 1700s. It was not a house, not a temple, not a Giorana. It was a chamber, circular, dug into the earth and covered with overlapping bark tiles, like a turtle's shell. The entrance was narrow, only tall enough for a child to crawl through, and the interior barely fit for people sitting close. Inside, the walls were painted, not in elaborate scenes, not in animal forms or celestial diagrams, but in patterns, circles, cross-hatched grids, repeating glyphs that resembled neither known Algonquian nor Iroquoian Symbology, and at the center of the chamber, a ring of stones enclosed a pile of ashdot. Was not the ash of firewood, it was the ash of parchment. Dozens, perhaps hundreds of burned paper scraps. Some were written in charcoal, others scratched with ochre or faded dyes. Nothing legible remained. This, it seemed, had been a place of forgetting, not remembrance. A room not for keeping stories safe, but for setting them free. Anthropologists who later studied the site called it the Chamber of Unwriting. That's not what the tribe called it, of course. No one knows that, but across several southeastern tribal oral histories, Chactaw, Sponi, Akanichi, there exists a recurring legend of the Inquiters, a people who wrote their own laws in charcoal and then, at the end of each generation, burned them in ritual fire. Believing that history was a burden best carried by the sky. This concept is that memory can be a kind of poisonous unique. In various cultures, from the Druze of Lebanon to certain Indian highland villages, some groups protect their inner history by not passing it on. What outsiders see as forgetfulness, they see as protection. But this tribe is forgotten people by the river. They didn't just forget, they removed themselves, erased their own name, and yet fragments lingered in a private letter dated 1768. A missionary wrote, "We encountered a child wandering near the river, brown-skinned, no older than 7, mute. He wore around his neck a carved bone circle, etched with patterns I cannot translate. We took him in, but he never spoke not a word, not even in sleep." In a separate letter, 2 years later, the boy, now 10, has vanished. He left only the pendant. It bears the same pattern as the ruins in the southern glen. I believe he was one of them. These are the scattered breadcrumbs that history leaves behind. My proof, but suggestion. Impressions on soft ground, enough to guess the path, but not to walk it confidently. And sometimes, Kate, that's enough. Let's pause here and consider the timeline. By 1770. The tribe had not been seen in over 70 years. The burial sites had been emptied, their sacred objects hidden. To children, any remained raised in silence or fostered into other tribes. And yet, 1805, an amateur naturalist named Josiah Lamont documented the strangest find of his career while cataloging medicinal plants near that same bend in the river. He found a tree, a tulip poplar, massive and ancient, carved with symbols, dozens of them, up the trunk and across 3 lower branches, glyphs nearly identical to those in the underground chamber, but now weathered by over a century of rain and wind, and embedded at the base of the tree, a clay jar. Inside, fragments of crushed bone, tiny teeth, and a rolled scrap of deer hide. When soaked and flattened, the hide revealed more symbols, this time forming what appeared to be a calendar or a ritual sequence, possibly a warning. The hide, tragically, was lost in a flood during transport, but the symbols were copied before its destruction. And here's where it gets strange. In 1997, a linguist working on a separate Cherokee manuscript discovered nearly identical symbols within a 19th century healing chant. The chant was marked as non-Cherokee, origin unknown, meaning someone, somewhere, had carried the forgotten tribe's script forward. A piece of their language survived, not in speech, not in names, but in rhythm, in medicine, in song, and so we return to the river, still unnamed in modern maps, still mostly dry in the summer, overflowing in spring, still flanked by trees that lean just slightly, as if listening for a sound that never returns. No tribe lives there now. No bones lie beneath it. But if you visit in October, when the last leaves fall and the mist clings to the forest floor like a blanket, you may find the old chamber still standing. And inside, if you listen closely, you might hear something. Not speech, not song, just a pattern of silence, of forgetting, of choosing to leave nothing behind. Not out of fear, not out of weakness, but because they believed the forest remembered better than people ever could. The year was 1831, when the first serious attempt was made to map what remained of the unnamed tribe's land. The United States was deep in the throes of forced relocation, the Indian removal. A contract had just been signed by President Andrew Jackson, and surveyors were rushing to catalog everything east of the Mississippi before it was either ceded, sold, or cleared. One such man, Thomas Granville, was an amateur cartographer with a peculiar obsession. He believed in what he called cartographic resurrection. It's the idea that drawing lost places on a map could bring them back into historical memory. He wasn't wrong, but the land didn't want to be drawn. Granville and his assistant spent 6 weeks along the bend of that slow, secret river, taking notes by candlelight and measuring by compass and twine. And what they found over and over again were faint paths that didn't lead to villages or camps, but to nothing at all. Forks in trails that circled back on themselves, to stone markers that crumbled at the touch. Sense, as one journal entry put it, that the land itself recoils from being remembered. Still, Granville persisted in his field notes, now housed in a dusty archive in Raleigh. There are dozens of sketches, tiny glyphs copied from tree trunks, strange notches carved into sandstone outcroppings. Above all, the recurring shape of a circle with no center. He wrote, "There is no name for this people. I've asked 6 tribes for elders, 2 missionaries. All say the same. They were not spoken of, even in the 1700s. One elder called them the hollow ones, not from shame, but from absence. Why would a tribe erase itself? Why leave behind glyphs, but no stories? Why remove their bones, but not their buildings?" Scholars have debated this for decades, and though we may never know with certainty, 3 major theories have emerged. Each is plausible. None is complete. Let's walk through them slowly, one by one. Theory 1, a devastating betrayal. Some historians argue the tribe was wiped out by betrayal from within, a splintering, a civil divide. One group aligned with European settlers, perhaps for trade or protection, while the other resisted, viewing it as a corruption of their values. This split may have ended violently. Blood may have been spilled, not between strangers, but cousins, elders, and in the aftermath, guilt or shame may have driven the survivors to erase the entire record, not out of fear of being hunted, but fear of being remembered incorrectly. One Choctaw elder, in a 1920 oral history, speaks of a ghost village where children were raised never to speak of their ancestors' choices, where even names were traded for roles. Like listener, shadow, or sleeper, that oral thread leads right back to the river. Theory 2, sacred separation. Another theory draws on religious or spiritual practices in several southeastern tribal traditions. There is the idea that spiritual contamination, whether by disease, violation of sacred laws, or improper burial, can linger in both land and language. Some cultures resolve this with purification, others with abandonment. But for this tribe, the theory goes, the transgression was so complete, so deep, could not be purified, so they isolated themselves, not geographically, but spiritually. They deliberately stopped trading, stopped speaking, stopped making marks that would be read by others. Then, when the time came, they quietly disassembled their own identity. Some were adopted into neighboring tribes. Some fled north. Others, perhaps, remained in silence. An intentional dissolution of culture, not a massacre, not a genocide, but cultural evaporation. Theory 3. Protection through silence. This final theory is the most poetic, and perhaps the most disturbing. It suggests that the tribe possessed knowledge, perhaps medicinal, spiritual, or cosmological, that was deemed too dangerous to pass on, not because of its power, but because of what it cost to gain. Some linguists believe that the repeating glyph found in both the chamber and the tulip, poplet wreath, circle with no center may be a symbol of sealing, a closure. Kata, not unlike the way Tibetan monks create mandalas only to destroy them. This tribe may have recorded their deepest knowledge, not to preserve it, but to let it go. In this theory, every burial was a ritual, every burned parchment a veil, and every vanished name a final act of love, to protect the world from what they knew, or to protect themselves from the weight of knowing. But let's pause for a moment and return to the ground. In 1873, a railroad surveyor named Edward Wainwright made a startling discovery while clearing a potential track path along that same river bend. He and his crew unearthed what they believed to be a cache of fire charred stones arranged in a spiral pattern, buried 2 feet beneath the soil. Within the spiral were shards of broken ceramics and several stone tools, not remarkable on their own, till they realized that the ceramic fragments bore writing, not paint, not carving, but microscopic scratches, etched with something so fine it likely required a sharpened thorn or sliver of bone. The fragments were sent to a museum in Boston, where they were labeled non-classifiable and placed in storage. They sat in a drawer for over a century, until 1989, when a graduate student researching lost native scripts rediscovered them and had them scanned under higher resolution imaging. What they found sent ripples through the linguistic community. Each fragment bore the same pattern, repeating loops, nested spirals. One large glyph, broken across 3 shards, matched nearly perfectly with the deer hide scrap found a century earlier. It was not a message, it was not a word, it was a map, a symbolic one not of terrain, but of time. Time divided not into months or years, but into eras of silence. The student, whose thesis was never published, wrote, "This tribe did not measure life by seasons or stars, but by the space between stories. They lived in epochs defined by what they refused to say." Is that how they mark time? By the length of forgetting? By the intervals of stillness between great events? If so, it would explain their reluctance to leave behind linear history. It would explain the absence of spoken legends, of heroes, of battles. For them, perhaps, history was sacred because it could disappear, because each silence was a choice, not a failure. Today, a land where the tribe once lived is forest again. No town stands there, no road cuts through it, only foot trails, visible in fall when the leaves fall and the undergrowth dies back. Some modern tribes in the region descendants of the Sapone, the Catawba, and the May Heron refer to the river bend by a single phrase, where the breath ends. It's not a translation, it's not even a name. It's a placeholder for something older, it's heavier, and never meant to be said aloud. And if you ever find yourself standing there beside that quiet river where memory once flowed and then was stilled, you may hear birds, you may hear wind, but mostly you will hear nothing. And that's the point. In 1872, on a windswept plain somewhere in the Dakota Territory, a soldier was found lying face down in a shallow basin of water with no wounds on his body and no signs of struggle in the grass. His horse had wandered off. His rifle was strapped neatly to his back. He looked as if he had simply laid down to sleep and never woken up. He was a cartographer, one of many that accompanied the U.S. Army's westward expansions, tasked not with battle, but with documentation. His name was Thomas Hale, and inside his breast pocket, still dry in a folded oilskin wrap, was a small piece of parchment that would confuse and disturb historians for the next 150 years. The sketch was simple, a circle drawn with thick, deliberate strokes. Okay. Inside it, 12 notches arranged like a clock, except they ran counterclockwise. At the center of the circle was a mark like an inverted triangle with 3 dots beneath it. Next to the drawing were just 3 words, scrawled in barely legible graphite. They don't forget. There were no names, no landmarks, no indication of what the map pointed to or what it recorded. The only other detail was a set of short lines extending from the bottom edge of the circle, resembling routes or veins or roads. The military command archived it without ceremony. Officially, they logged it as miscellaneous field drawing, non-cartographic. Unofficially, it became known among some as Hale's map that led nowhere. And yet, over the years, it began to look more and more like something familiar, something real. In the 1930s, an archaeologist named Lucien Cobb, working on indigenous petroglyph sites in the lower Missouri River Valley, found something uncanny on a wide slab of stone, half buried beneath a layer of silt. He uncovered a circle. Inside, its 12 hash marks at the center ran inverted triangle, 3 dots beneath. He thought it was a coincidence, but then, 30 miles south, he found another, and this time, a few feet away, a decayed animal skull had been arranged beside 3 rocks, each one carved with a single, deep gouge. The marks weren't decorative, they were warnings. Some local Dakota elders knew of the pattern, or at least they knew to stay away from it. One elder, a woman named Red Clay Moon, told Cobb quietly that the marks were not meant for the living. Those are places where the earth remembers too much, she said. You can feel it if you sit long enough. The air feels heavier, like it's trying not to speak. She refused to say more. When Cobb asked if it was from a specific tribe, she just looked out toward the hills and said, "Some names unname themselves." What does that mean, to unname oneself? It's a concept that returns again and again when we look into the historical shadows of tribes whose memories were scrubbed, not by war or colonization, but seemingly by choice. There are moments in indigenous oral tradition where individuals, or sometimes even whole communities, remove themselves from memory, ritualistically, with purpose. In the Haudenosaunee tradition, there are accounts of memory fasts, periods when an elder would refuse to speak any personal names, erase stories, and symbolically offer their identity back to the forest. But what would make an entire tribe do such a thing? There are no treaties with their name, no battles officially recorded against them, no trade agreements, no linguist notes, no burial records. And yet, sites where the circle within a circle symbol appears, strange consistencies surface. Trees grow in tight spirals, even in species that usually do not twist. The ground temperature is cooler than surrounding regions. Nearby streams exhibit higher than average mineral content. Animals avoid nesting within the ring-even birds, and sometimes old stone cairns are found, partially collapsed, built from quarried rock not found anywhere else within 200 miles. Why build with imported stone in the middle of open prairie? Why shape it into unmarked stacks and scatter it in patterns no one can decipher? Perhaps because the message was never for us. In 1982, a team of surveyors discovered something even stranger. While flying over northern Nebraska with early infrared imaging, they spotted what looked like enormous, shallow impressions across the landscape, dozens of them, nearly symmetrical, always 12, always arranged in a circle to the naked eye on the ground. They were invisible, but the cameras caught them. The soil in those 12 spots retained heat differently, almost as if something long buried still lay beneath. Artifacts, ash pits, foundations. No one knows the land is privately owned now. Attempts to investigate were denied. The owners simply said, "We don't go there anymore." It would be easy to dismiss this as myth, coincidence of patterns, an overreach of imagination. But then, Thomas Hale's map appears again. In 2005, researcher going through uncatalogued army documents in Fort Leavenworth stumbled across another copy of the circle with 12 marks, this time sketched in charcoal on a piece of tree bark, attached to a bundle of field reports from 1869. No explanation, no context, just the drawing, folded inside it, a short note. We found the stone rings again. The horses would not cross them. Something smells burnt, but there's no fire. We are not staying the night. And then a signature. T.H. Thomas Hale had seen the rings more than once. He'd drawn them more than once. And if this was the second note, was there a third? And what happened between that and the day he was found lying in a basin with no wounds? Man trained to draw maps, to record what others miss, to trace a path for others to follow. But this map wasn't meant to be followed among certain Choctaw oral histories. There is a recurring reference to the keepers of the hollow wind. They are described not as spirits or ghosts, but as people, a community that refused to raise their houses above the earth and spoke backwards on the days the sun refused to rise. Most historians dismiss this as poetic metaphor, perhaps a reference to cave dwellers, or simply a seasonal ritual. But what if it was more literal? What if these were the same people marked by the 12 circles? What if they chose not to leave behind names, but patterns? So now we're left with another question. What did Thomas Hale see? What drove him to write "They Don't Forget" beneath a pattern that's been burned into the soil of at least a dozen sites from the Missouri River to the Sandhills? What don't they forget? Who are they? And what does it mean to be remembered by the earth, but forgotten by the world? The answers, if they exist, may still be buried beneath cold circles, beneath twisted trees, beneath the places the horses won't walk, and beneath the quiet insistence of patterns that return again and again, just enough to suggest a voice, but never loud enough to hear the words. Sometimes history leaves you with a story, sometimes only with a silence. The land where the forgotten tribe once lived, still unmarked on many maps, has been many things. Sanctuary, a scar, secret, and across the decades, it has drawn an unusual kind of pilgrim. Not tourist, not treasure hunters, but memory seekers, those who are not looking for answers, but for the echo of a presence too quiet to speak. One of the first such seekers was a woman named Alma Red Feather, a Lakota ethnography who visited the Bend in 1927. She had heard stories from her grandfather, a trader who once passed through the Piedmont in the late 1800s and claimed to have seen a tree carved with symbols, that made his horse stop in fear. She found no such tree, but what she did find was something else. Alma stayed for 5 nights. She camped alone just beyond the river, spent each day walking in wide loops through the forest. What she reported, in a letter to a university colleague, was not tangible. It was not archaeological. It was emotional and quiet. The birds do not sing here, not in the morning, not in the twilight. I have never known a land so green to be so voiceless. She spoke of feeling watched, not in a threatening way, but in a way that made her feel like she was entering a story still being written. And then, on the 4th morning, she found something. Not buried, not hidden, but simply waiting. It was a stone, not large, not ornate, resting at the base of a crooked tree near the river's edge. What made it unusual was that it was entirely smooth on one side, polished, not naturally, but by human hands. Alma recognized the technique. She'd seen it used by her own people to create memory stones, objects not meant to contain writing, but feeling. When she lifted it, she said it was warm, and when she set it back down a few feet away, she found another. This one chipped, hollow on one side, filled with pine needles, but clearly shaped by hands. She spent hours collecting these 8, in total each slightly different. She left them all where they were, but she remembered their arrangement. A spiral, always a spiral, That pattern, by now, had become a signature. Archaeologists still debate its meaning. Some call it a cosmological map, others a mourning pattern. One fringe theory suggests it represents a psychological concept memory collapse, but perhaps it was something simpler. A spiral has no end, it's only a center you never reach. Let us go further back, much further, before the spiral, before the glyphs, before the tribe disappeared from memory. They must have existed in memory. Someone had to speak their name. Someone had to pass down their language, their stories, their kin, and yet no record remains, not even among neighboring tribes. That absence has led many to ask, were they ever real? And if so, did they choose this disappearance, or was it chosen for them? In 1704, a Jesuit missionary wrote a letter from a French settlement near the Blue Ridge Mountains. His writing, translated from Latin, contains this passage. There are whispers of a tribe to the southeast, whose children wear no clan markings, and whose elders will not speak their origins. They have built no council fires, except no marriage from outside. One calls them the sleepers. I find the name fitting. It's that word again, sleepers. It has appeared now in at least 3 unrelated oral traditions across different regions and tribes, always referring to a people who retreat, who withhold, let their name vanish. Were they the same people? Or has the idea of a sleeping tribe become a symbol of something we sense but cannot grasp? In 1955, a team of anthropologists tried to dig deeper literally and figuratively. They conducted an excavation at the site near the bend, now partially flooded by a diverted stream. What they found was nothing, no bones, no tools, no fire pits, but the soil itself was strange. It had been turned once, centuries ago, then packed down, layered with crushed moss and silt, almost as if someone had buried time itself. It baffled them. Why go to such lengths to bury nothing, unless that was the point? Imagine for a moment, that you are a member of this tribe. You wake up each morning knowing that the world around you remembers less and less of what you are. You see your neighbors learn new languages. You see old trails covered with stones. You watch the seasons shift, and with them, the rules of who can marry, who can trade, who can speak. And one day, your elders tell you, we are ending the name, not in defeat, but in ceremony, because they have decided that surviving is not always about being seen. Sometimes it's about being gone. In 1991, a child hiking with her father found a bundle of twine buried in a tree hollow. Inside were strips of bark, bound in a circle, like a wheel with no spokes. Each strip had marks, not letters, not drawings, just lines, tiny slashes, repeating in groups of 4. It took months before linguists realized what they might represent. Lunar cycles. They marked not days, but silences. Each slash was a vow, a month of not speaking, perhaps of stillness, of invisible mourning. Could this have been a calendar of grief? A reckoning? Oh, was it simply a diary with no author? The bundle now rests in a drawer at a university, under controlled humidity. No one has opened it in years. The tape label just says, found object, origin unknown, probable native, placeholder. Even now, the forgetting continues. But let's return one final time to that river dot, to the bend that no one names. In 2021, drone scans revealed something remarkable beneath the canopy. A vast ring, visible from the ground, etched only in the subtle differences in tree age and growth. Pattern it was massive, over 600 feet across, and within it, concentric circles, one after another, like ripples, or a spiral. No structures, no mounds, but something lived there once, something organized, something that walked in patterns too soft to leave footprints, yet too deliberate to be random. Some now call it the silent city. But it was no city. It was a memory written in leaves and wind. And now we return to the question, why was this entire tribe wiped from Native American memory? The answer may be because they wanted to be, because they had to be, or because their memory was never for us. It belonged to them, and to the trees, and to the river, to the silence. The map was still in the archives. It hadn't faded. Not even the graphite. Some archivists say that Thomas Hale's drawing is one of the few field sketches from that era still fully legible. Despite the crumbling of other documents stored in the same box, the oilskin had preserved it, certainly. But it was as though even time had hesitated to erode it. The pattern of 12 notches remained crisp. The triangle still pointed downward. The 3 dots still nestled underneath like silent stones, and above it all, the words still whispered from across the page. They don't forget. The United States Army had hundreds of cartographers like Thomas Hale. Most were quietly forgotten, their hand-drawn surveys replaced by formal topographic maps. Hay stood out, not just for what he drew, but for where he refused to go. His journals included notes that looked more like hesitations than data, pages where he'd written half a line before crossing it out, fragments that read, "To still hear, even the birds." SGTM didn't wake up last night. No wound. It's a smell like old copper and snow, but it's midsummer. And, again, the recurring sentence, "We should not have found this." He never elaborated on what this was, but it appeared often, always, when the team camped near certain ridges bare, wine-scoured places with no names, no tribal affiliation, and no signs of settlement. One of the more chilling entries came just a week before his death. I heard singing last night, rhythmic, like chanting, but in reverse. I could not understand the words. There were no fires, only stars. The wind didn't move. It was a single sentence. But what does it mean to hear singing in reverse? In indigenous storytelling traditions, names are power. To name something is to give it breath. To speak it aloud is to bind it to memory, to history, to life. But just as a name can summon, it can also release. There are recorded rituals among the Arapaho, Comanche, and Zuni involving the laying down of a name, usually reserved for the dead or for those who had committed spiritual betrayals. The ceremony often involved burying an object that represented the person, sealing it in earth, and then instructing the community never to say the name again. Sometimes, entire families vanished this way not by death, but by silence. The ritual was complete only when no child could recall the face. Could it be that what Hay stumbled upon was not forgotten through loss, but erased by intent? In 1889, 2 decades after Hale's death, a young Dakota linguist named Louis Bluebird attempted to trace variations of the circle and notch pattern in oral myths across tribes of the Plains and Great Lakes regions. What he found was less of a story and more of a shared absence when he asked about the pattern. Many elders simply said, "That's not ours." But when he showed it to multiple tribal groups who had no contact with one another, Ojibwe, Potawatomi, Mandan, they responded with the exact same phrasing. "It is not to be told. Those are not our dead. You should not show that." As consistency among otherwise disparate groups unsettled Bluebird. His notes were later archived with a single sentence at the top of the folder. Everywhere, the same silence. What if silence itself was the warning? The 12 notches, the triangle, the 3 dots, the refusal to name. It paints a picture not of something forgotten by chance, but by effort. A memory sealed shut, not lost in the wind, but buried by those who remembered too well. And who were they who don't forget? Some native spiritual traditions do not distinguish between the living and the dead in the same way modern cultures do. The land remembers. The wind remembers. And sometimes it is sad. The earth bears the weight of memory more gently than any tongue could carry. In recent years, drone imaging and thermal scans have picked up strange soil temperatures and concentric patterns across parts of the northern plains. The anomalies appear only in spring and late autumn, and always they form rings. Geologists say the data may reflect changes in subsurface, mineral content, or underground water channels. But when asked if the patterns are natural, one hydrologist said, the odds of this arrangement occurring by chance are strange. Too many of them are perfect circles. Nature rarely makes perfect circles. And yet no archaeological team has excavated them. Most are unprotected or disputed. Land, a few are within private ranches. Access is difficult, and interest wanes, as if even curiosity fades near those places. There's a concept in some tribal epistemologies called dream memory. Unlike historical memory passed through speech, ceremony, or record, dream memory is transferred unconsciously, through sleep, through breath, through blood. It's not remembered with the waking mind, but carried in the marrow of those who live nearby. One such account came from a Pawnee elder, born in the early 1900s, who said, "When I was young, I used to dream of 12 stones standing in water, like teeth. A woman stood at the center and sang backwards. I woke up with dirt in my mouth." She never saw the hail map. She never saw the infrared photos. She never studied petroglyphs, but her dream matched the description: 12 points, central figure, reverse song. It begs a question: what is remembered when all other memory is erased? Some believe Thomas Hale's final note, "They don't forget," was not about him remembering something terrifying, but about the land remembering something the rest of the world tried to erase. Perhaps the map was never meant to lead to a place. Perhaps was a warning to stay away. A recording of where memory still lives, where names, even unnamed, still echo. Where the ground has not forgotten the tribe that chose silence over survival. There's a theory among a few indigenous scholars that this vanished group, whose name cannot be found, may have chosen this fate willingly. Why? Perhaps they witnessed something so sacred or so devastating that, to allow others to know it would be a betrayal. Perhaps they made a pact with the earth itself to let memory take root in soil, not in voice, and if so, then every time we try to map it, it fades. Every time we try to say the name, the syllables scatter, but the pattern remains. 12 marks, a center, 3 dots, a silence. It's not the first time a people have vanished from records without clear cause. The ancestral Pueblones, the Cahokia mound builders, the Dorset culture of the Arctic, all gone. Not through war necessarily, not through plague, but as if they simply walked away from history and left behind only questions in stone, burned soil, and dreams. So what do we do with this? This map with no legend, this pattern with no name, this tribe with no memory except for the places where the wind goes quiet and the horses refuse to walk. Is this a story of erasure or of preservation? Did they vanish, or did they choose to live forever in a way that cannot be spoken? Maybe the warning isn't for them. Maybe it's for us, not to dig, not to trace, not to wake what chose to sleep, and not to name what was once unnamed by its own people.